And the reason I'm talking about this orientation sort of after I've already presented some of the teachings is because it's so important that I wanted to put it at the end rather than at the beginning, because in the beginning, by the time you listen to the various aspects of the teaching, you forget the orientation, you forget the atmosphere in which the whole teaching exists. So my hope is by talking about this after I've presented the basic, the sort of fundamentals of the teaching, is that it won't be forgotten. Is that that what all the teachings are about are ways to surrender self. Even, the teachings that help lead us to awakening. When we awaken, we realize that we are not our ego. We are not the person we thought we were. That's a sort of spontaneous grace. It's a spontaneous act of surrender. And when this spontaneous act of surrender happens, then there is a shift of consciousness, a shift of identity, a shift of how we see ourselves, of how we perceive ourselves. But this shift can't happen without a surrender. So sometimes insight leads to surrender. Sometimes one just simply surrenders. Sometimes inquiry helps lead to surrender. Sometimes to be still leads to surrender. You see? So if you see the teachings in their proper context, well, as I said, whether it's inquiry, whether it's meditation, whether it's being aware, all these are actually, you have to surrender the basic impulse of ego to engage in any of the teaching effectively. So in other words, we take something like meditation. Very often when people meditate, it's their egos that are meditating. They're looking for a more beneficial state. Their egos are still trying to seize control. They're trying to control their experience. They're trying to avoid what they don't want to experience and move towards what they do want to experience. And one may even get relatively good at this. But ultimately, it's not particularly relevant spiritually because it can actually enhance the doership and the grasping at control that is the hallmark of ego. So even something as simple as meditation, sitting in stillness, can, if we don't understand the general orientation of a spiritual teaching, it can actually become very egoically based and actually enhance the very qualities that one is trying to wake up from, that one is trying to let go of. So, ego, lower self, is in an almost continuous state of not allowing things to be the way they are. That's what ego does. It's in an almost continual state of not allowing everything to be. Because if the ego allows everything to be, then there's peace, then there's happiness, then there's the falling away of division, which is something that the ego cannot allow to happen, not for very long, maybe for brief moments, but not for very long. And so ego will tend to try to seize control. It'll stop allowing experience to be the way it is. It will exercise its will. It will exercise its effort to control, to try to have a different experience. And if we don't understand the context in which a spiritual teaching arises and plays itself out, then we can actually get caught up in the will of lower self or ego. And the will of the lower self, the will of ego, can very easily dominate the whole of one's spiritual quest in a very subtle way that might be hard to recognize. So this is why I want to really emphasize this atmosphere, the context in which these teachings take place, the context in which your whole spiritual life unfolds, is ultimately about surrender. The surrender of self, the surrender of division. Whatever causes internal division is surrendered. Okay? So all the teachings are simply ways to allow that surrender to happen. If you forget that spirituality is about how much of self can be let go of, if you forget that, then the spiritual teachings are not really going to be so effective. They may even be used on a very subtle level to strengthen the underlying ego's tendency to grasp and control.